Okay, guys. Good morning. Welcome back. How's everyone doing? Hopefully you're doing great. Just have a little under 2 minutes until we get the meeting started today. But as usual, good to see you guys. Hey, Celine. Welcome back. Leo, hey there. Kenny, Sophia. Good morning to all the philosophers. Nice. No, it's okay, Mia. Good morning. Hey, Jason. Good time. Justin, Janice, Brittany, Angel. Hopefully you guys are doing well. Kevin, Melanie, Christian, welcome. Okay, guys, so I'm getting things started now that we're here at 10 a.m. Welcome back, as usual. Hope y'all had a great weekend. And just so that we're all keeping this clear in our calendars, your second essay is not due next week, but it's due Monday. Sorry, I meant to say Tuesday of the May 11th, so 2 weeks from today. So just, keep that in your mind. Don't push it down to the last minute and get into it right before it's due. These philosophy papers always benefit from a little more time and attention. So I would just say at least think about your notes, identifying your topic and stuff throughout the week, and then you'll have plenty of time still to work on it. Okay, so what we're doing is we're continuing to work through these notes on the philosophy of mind topic. We covered Descartes and his argument for dualism last week. So I'll just start today by quickly recapping the major points in his argument, and then we will switch over to the next author who talks about physicalism and why he thinks that physicalism, the physicalist branch of monism, is true. Okay, so just kind of making sure we're all aware of our topic. We're talking now about the philosophy of mind, which is a part of philosophy that is engaged in questions about consciousness, the study of consciousness. So consciousness is a word that refers to anything having to do with your mental life, whether it's thoughts, pleasures, pains, experience, perception. I mean, literally, like, think about the difference between a life form that has consciousness and an inanimate object like this eraser. There's nothing that it's like to be this eraser. There's no pleasure, pain, perception, no humor or desire or anything else, right? So we, though, are conscious beings. And so consciousness is the subject matter of philosophy of mind. Questions concerning it involve whether it's just a physical process. Is it just the brain that is the whole source of consciousness? Or is there something that's not physical when it comes to thought and consciousness and perception? Could a machine ever think? What about that? So we'll look at questions like those. There are two main positions in the philosophy of mind. You have monism and dualism. So monism says that everything in the whole universe is just made out of one kind of substance. And dualism says that everything in the universe is made out of two kinds of substances. Now, what are these different substances that are being referred to? One of them is the concept of physical matter, which is just anything that is extended in space, something that occupies space, and the most tiny unit of that would often be referred to as the atom. So that's one of the substances, physical matter, just basically particles of matter. And then mind, in the philosophical sense, is the non-extended, so has no extension, size, shape, mass, volume. It's just not a physical object, but it's conscious, it's thinking. So that's kind of like the idea of a soul, something that has no material form, but yet has consciousness. And so dualism says there's both of these things. There's matter and there's mind. So like a human body, for example, or a human being, is a combination of both. The physical body is what you see here, but the mind, according to dualism, is something that is not physical, and it can survive the total destruction of the body, as people claim with the idea of the afterlife, and etc. On the other hand, monism will claim that everything, well, there's two types of monism. So physicalist monism is the one that says everything's made out of matter, even the mind, even your consciousness. And idealism is the other type of monism, which says everything is an idea. But what we are really focused on is this debate between physicalism and dualism. Now, we're studying arguments for both of those. And the first argument we did look at was last week, where we took a look at Descartes' argument for dualism. So I'm just going to now go over a couple of brief summary points about his argument, and then we can move on from that for the moment. So with Descartes, he said in his Meditations, which he wrote back in 1641, let's try to find out what's certain. He thought that in order to find out what is certain, we would have to use the method of doubt. And he thought that we should seek out certainty because, as he sees it, there has to be something that is a foundation for human knowledge. And whatever's at the foundations has to be something that cannot be doubted. So anyway, what's the way of finding out certainty? Use the method of doubt. It says to assume that anything is false if it could even possibly be doubted. So once we use this method of doubt, the argument now proceeds. With the method of doubt being used, you're able to doubt everything that you perceive with your five senses, and even math and logic. Hey there, Sergio, not to worry, good to see you. So as I was saying, with the method of doubt, we can doubt everything that we perceive with our senses, even math and logic. The reasons for that is that it could possibly be that this is all a dream, or that there's some kind of external source of deception that makes you make errors whenever you try to formulate conclusions about anything, even math. So the method of doubt leaves you with no certainty about anything that you perceive with the five senses and even math. But one thing that is certain, even with the method of doubt, is that your mind exists. And that's obviously true because you are just thinking. So even if you can't be sure whether or not you even have a body, you know you have a mind because it is thinking. So that's something you can be sure of. From there, he says, since I know I have a mind and it has thoughts, well, what are the ideas? One of the ideas in your mind is the idea of God. And he singles that out because he says this is a unique and special idea, different from all the others, because it's the idea of an infinite being. Okay, so the next step is that he says, since we have an idea of an infinite being, it has to be caused by something that is at least infinite, because otherwise there would be no way for this idea to have occurred in your mind. So that means that there's a cause of your idea of God, which is infinite, and that thing that causes the idea is God. So God must exist. Otherwise, you'd never have the idea of him. And it's the only possible explanation of how you have the idea of him. So he says this means God exists. And from there, he says God is known to be infinitely good, and so therefore he's not a deceiver. So since God is not a deceiver, this implies that if you have clear and distinct perception about something, then it has to be true. Because if it were not, again, God would be deceiving, which he's too good to do. So what's a clear and distinct perception? He mentions a couple, but the one that's really important for his argument about dualism is that he says whenever you can clearly conceive of two things existing separately, like you can clearly imagine these two things existing separately, that means that they really could exist separately and are therefore two different things. I gave you the example of me and this watch, which, as you can tell, is on my wrist, but it's easy to imagine me and the watch being separated from each other. And since it's clearly easy to conceive of that, since it's possible to imagine it, that means that me and the watch are not the same thing. Okay, so finally at the end, he says, it is clearly conceivable for you to imagine your mind existing with no body. Like you can clearly imagine a case where you still have consciousness, but there's no body there. And since that's clearly conceivable, just like with me and the watch being imagined to exist separately, since you can clearly imagine or conceive of your mind and body existing separately, they really are two different things, as guaranteed by the perfectly good God who makes sure that clear and distinct perceptions are true. So therefore, the mind and the body are two different things. And then after that, he says, it's also clear and distinct that the external world exists for a few reasons I mentioned at the end of the last lecture. And he also says it's pretty clear and distinct that you have a body, because with respect to your own body, you can control it, what it does with your mind, but not others. And you experience sensations when any stimuli is applied to your body, but not to others. Like, so if somebody pinches someone else, you don't feel the pain, but of course, if it was done to you, you would. And then also he mentions that you cannot like depart from your body and go somewhere else while it stays behind. And that is another reason to think that you have a kind of intimate connection to it, that it is yours, even though the mind that you have is essentially separate from it. Okay, so that's the argument for dualism from Descartes. Just a quick run through. I know that we spent a lot more time on it before, but since it's already been covered, I'm just trying to condense it down into a brief restatement. So then now let's continue from there. There's other positions in this debate. So we say that dualism is against monism, and specifically we're looking at the physicalist version of monism. So what about physicalism? Now let's try and understand those that argue in favor of it and see why they think that's the better school of thought. Today then, the author is this man, Daniel Stoljar. Okay, Daniel Stoljar. And I don't exactly know the dates of his life because he's still living, he's pretty young. But anyway, in 2005, he wrote the paper we're about to look at. And he's an Australian philosopher. In 2005, he wrote this paper in our book, which is just called Physicalism. Okay, so Daniel Stoljar, 2005, Physicalism. So his goal with this paper is pretty much just to explain what physicalism is, and then to try and defend it and to argue that it's really true. So he has two sort of goals. One, explain to us what's physicalism, and two, tell us why you think that's true. So as he begins the paper, he says, let's just get a baseline definition of physicalism on the table. And the definition that he suggests is pretty blunt and plain spoken. He says, here's physicalism. This is what it means. So he says it's just this idea. Physicalism simply is just the idea that everything is physical. Okay, so that's it. Everything is physical. Okay, so that's the stance that physicalism holds. That everything, 100% of everything is physical. It's a strong claim because it's not saying most things are physical or some things are physical. It's saying every single thing. Even you and me and our thoughts, it's all just physical. And it's a thesis about what everything in this whole universe is made out of. It says that all these things, at the end of the day, they're all just made out of matter. They're all made out of atoms that are put together in various combinations and forms. Even your thought and your consciousness, which sometimes you think of as something different from just a physical object, is itself just the byproduct of the physical brain and its material processes and its electrochemical signals, etc. So it says everything's physical. According to this view that everything's physical, Stoljar says one implication of it is that certain fields of study that we don't usually think of having anything to do with physics are actually just indirectly branches of physics. So, hey there, Jason. Anyway, yeah, so the author says that everything is an indirect branch of physics, even things that do not immediately appear to have anything to do with it. So say, for example, by the way, I don't know if you guys are hearing any kind of noise pollution. There is some like construction work. They're replacing gutters and stuff right outside of my home here. And so nothing I can do about that, but I'm trying to talk over it. Nonetheless, as I was saying, according to what Stoljar says, every field of study is at least indirectly a branch of physics. Let me explain. So someone may think they're studying history, and they're like, yeah, I'm glad I'm not studying physics because history is not at all having anything to do with that, and that sounds way more difficult, maybe. Even though some people say history is less precise than physics, and that's more difficult. But anyway, suppose someone thinks that history has nothing to do with physics. Probably that's a reasonable point of view. But, you know, what is history according to physicalism? It's just events that played out on the surface of this planet with these human being life forms that we are. And what are all those objects? I mean, human beings, according to physicalism, are just complex physical systems, biological life forms that perform certain actions. And all these events and actions are just the going on of organisms on a given planet operating according to the laws of physics. So you can say then that what is the French Revolution or something, but just a bunch of physical events governed by physical forces involving human beings, which themselves are just physical objects of a very complex kind. So whether it's poetry, music, history, dance, art, all these things that don't seem immediately to have much to do with physics, according to physicalism, it's all just physical stuff happening, and so everything's physical. Now, about monism, the view that everything is made out of just one kind of substance, physicalism is like the modern day, today version of monism. But there have been other types of monism going way back in the past. We talked about idealism, right? That's no longer really very well popular today. But if you go way, way back into like the ancient Greeks, thousands of years ago, there were some philosophers back then that also believed in monism, but they had some weird different versions of it that we would laugh at, I think, today. Like here, let me give you one example. One pre-Socratic Greek philosopher was named Thales. Pre-Socratic, meaning he was way, way, way back in the past, like before even Socrates. So it's like 2,500 years ago. Thales believed that everything in the universe is just made out of water. I mean, so that was his version of monism. Everything is water. Now, I mean, that's obviously kind of like a silly thought in the modern understanding of reality. We know much better than that today, but why would Thales have thought everything was made out of water? Well, I mean, keep in mind, this is thousands of years ago, so give him the benefit of the doubt, but I guess his thought was, well, water, you can see, can take different forms. Sometimes it's a solid. When it's frozen, it's like ice. Sometimes it's a liquid, clearly, at a room temperature. And then it can even be a vapor. He noticed that when you breathe on your hand, condensation and moisture collects. So he just thought maybe everything are just various states of water, all these things around us. Anyway, just mentioning that as a point of comparison and contrast. It's an old school, relegated to the dustbin of history version of monism, but today the monism we think is interesting and possibly true is physicalism, which says it's not all made out of water, but rather atoms of physical matter. Okay, so continuing from here. He next says, for us to really dive in and get clear about what physicalism is and to understand it in all depth, we have to kind of grapple with two big questions. So he says, here are two questions to consider about physicalism, and he's going to try to help us answer these. Okay, so two main questions about physicalism. That's the next part of our notes. Okay, so one of them he labels it as the interpretation question. And then the other one he labels as the truth question. Okay, so let me state what these two questions are. First of all, the interpretation question. So what it is asking is, what does it mean? What does it mean to say that everything is physical? So this question asks, how do we interpret the meaning of that claim? What does it mean? To say that everything is physical. What does that mean? So what does it mean to advance the position that everything is physical? That's one question. It's called the interpretation question because it's asking, how do we interpret the claim? How do we interpret this statement that everything is physical? What does this really say, in other words? Okay, now the truth question is related to that, but separate. And the truth question simply asks, is it true, though, that everything is physical? So apart from what it even means, we could also ask, is that true? Is it true that everything is physical? Okay, so what does it mean to say that everything is physical? And also, is it true that everything is physical? Now, the author says this. He says that in terms of dealing with these questions here, you really kind of have to address one of them before you can tackle the other. And I would love to ask you that. So let me just tap in, connect with you for a minute. Which of these two questions, just according to your common sense, do you think you would have to be able to give an answer for before you can move on to the other one? Like, which one has to be first? Because you really cannot answer the other one until you first answer this one. So which one do you think has to be dealt with first? Just let me know. Okay, Janice, you're saying truth question. Anybody else? Jerry, you say interpretation question, and Kobe, you say interpretation. Okay, so let me just break the tie, or it's not quite a tie, but it is the interpretation question that has to be answered first. Let me explain that, Janice, or anybody else. So you cannot determine whether a statement is true or not if you do not know what it means. Also, Angel, no, interpretation question is first. I'm explaining why. So you cannot determine whether a statement is true or false if you have no idea what it even means. Like here, I'll give you an example. What if I say this to you? I would watch out walking around today because they say that there's jargles all throughout Orange County. Be careful. Now look, can you tell me whether that's true or not? That there's jargles all throughout Orange County? Well, no, you can't tell me whether it's true or not. How could you investigate whether that's true or not if you do not know what the word means? If you don't know what the sentence means, then you can't go out and investigate to see if it's true or not, right? So you have to first have some type of working understanding of what a claim is before you can judge if it's true or false. Okay, now that's obviously a made-up nonsense word. Jargles is just something I made up. But the point is, if you're scratching your head, I don't even know what that means, then that's the point. Because if you don't know what it means, then how are you going to go out to determine whether it's a true or a false statement, right? You have to be able to compare the reality to the claim to see if it's true. But if you don't even know what the claim is saying, then you don't know what you're comparing reality with, because you don't know what the claim means. So we have to grapple with that interpretation question first, and then we can try and deal with the truth question afterwards. So let's do that. He says, let's now go into it and try and figure out what it does mean to say that everything is physical. Okay. So right now we're trying to give our best way of analyzing the interpretation of that claim or statement. So to answer the interpretation question, to figure out and to get clear on what it means to say that everything is physical, we have to utilize the notion of what is called supervenience. Okay, so supervenience is the common method or concept that's used to explain what it means to say all things are physical. So now we're talking about supervenience. This is like the core idea of his paper, perhaps. And it's important also for anybody who's considering writing on this topic, because supervenience is definitely mentioned directly in the language in the prompt. So supervenience, it's a word that is kind of like a term of technical jargon within philosophy and science. I've noticed that a lot of times it does not appear in the lexicon of a word check. So oftentimes it appears as like word correction, but it's not an error. Just so that we're all clear, because I know that sometimes the legibility is not perfect, I'm going to type it in the chat too. It's an important word and term. Supervenience. Okay, supervenience. Let's talk about supervenience. So what supervenience is a kind of relationship that exists between a large structure and the little parts that make it up. So whenever you have a composite structure that's built out of a bunch of tiny little parts or bits, we say that the large structure supervenes on those little parts. And the common example that's used to make this even more clear is what's called a dot matrix picture. Okay, dot matrix picture. Okay, now, dot matrix picture. So I know nowadays in 2021, a lot of times when we're looking at images of things, we're looking at them on screens, like your computer monitor or your mobile phone, your cell phone, or your television, right? So the concept of a dot matrix picture is a little bit old-fashioned in a way, because it refers to the method of creating images on printed paper. So like, you know, if you have a textbook, like just this is one example. This is a textbook for another class that I teach. It's got this picture on the front of this woman, right? So whether it's like the cover image on a book, or say the front page of the newspaper, or in like a comic book, you see drawings of things in there. When you zoom in really close, say to the image shown on the headline of the newspaper, like President Biden signing a bill in the Oval Office, and you zoom in really close to that image, if it's a dot matrix image, here's what you would see. That the big picture is actually created out of a bunch of tiny little dots that are imposed against a grid. And these dots are in a certain order and with certain color. And being in that order, color, and combination generates the big image that you see. So a dot matrix picture, to be a little simple about it, is just a big picture made out of a bunch of tiny little dots, okay? And that's something that you can see if you just use like magnification and you look up close at a printed picture in a magazine, newspaper, or whatever the case may be if it's on paper, right? Because these images, they're not magic how they are duplicated, okay? So like, how do you print every copy of the newspaper with the same exact cover image? Well, you have a blank grid against which a set of dots can be mapped. And you assign to each position on the grid dot of a different color or non-dots. And then once that superimposed distribution and order of dots can be stamped down onto the image, onto the page, then we can slide another page under and just keep duplicating it like that. Okay, so a dot matrix image is a way of duplicating pictures by creating a coordinate set of points onto which dots of ink can be mapped, okay? So in such a case, the big picture and whatever features that it has are nothing other than the order and distribution of the little dots that compose them. Now, I've gone to some trouble here to try and explain to you the old school dot matrix pictures, which of course they still do exist whenever you see printed materials on paper. But to kind of update the example a little bit for our modern day, let's try and think of the same concept, but using a digital device like your computer or cell phone. Okay, now, when you're looking at an image, video, or anything else, but let's go with an image. When you're looking at an image on a cell phone or a computer monitor or a television, and you zoom in really close, you would also see these little things that make the big picture up. Except in the case of a digital screen, they're not dots of ink. Can anybody tell me what they think or know about the little things that form the space and grid of your screen when you watch it or you see an image on it? I'm not talking about little dots, but what is the corollary to those on a computer or TV? That's right, pixels, correct naming. So even right now, as you're watching me on this screen that you're using, my image is beamed to you because there's a resolution to your device, and against the back of that resolution, there's a grid of pixels. Now, a pixel, when you look at it up close, is a tiny little panel, which is tri-colored. And basically, the computer or device that you use receives instructions about how to illuminate each pixel on the grid. And those instructions show you the image that you're looking at. When you zoom in really close, you see it's pixel, 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 a bunch of pixels. But when you zoom back out and you look at the big thing, you just see the image formed by the pixels. So an image shown on a digital device is also kind of like a dot matrix in the sense that it's a big picture, but it's formed out of assigned positions and the type of illumination given to each individual pixel in the device's screen. So whether you think about the dot matrix supervenience example in the concept of a printed picture, which is formed out of little dots of ink, or a digitized image like a meme or something or whatever when you're looking at it on your phone, and that's formed out of a bunch of little pixels. The concept is parallel in both cases. You have a big picture made out of a bunch of little parts. Whether they be dots of ink or pixels, the same concept applies in both cases. And again, with a digital device, why is it that the same image appears exactly on all the different devices? Like you share a picture to your friend or you post something and on their phone they see the same picture. Well, it's because the digital instructions about how to send pixel data to each pixel in the screen is mapped onto each new device. And so if it has a similar resolution, even if it has a little lower one, you're still going to see the same image. Okay, now, for the purposes of having visual aid, I'm going to try and draw a little example of a dot matrix picture here on the board. Of course, I'm working with crude tools. This is a felt tip expo marker, so the dots are going to be not very tiny. And also, I'm not an amazing artist when it comes to drawing things in the first place, but work with me, and hopefully you'll be able to make sense of this. Okay, so here's a little dot matrix picture, let's suppose. Okay, now look, not too bad actually, hopefully. I don't know, we'll see what you think. But first question is this. Simply tell me, do you think you can make sense of what I've tried to draw here? What is this scene or image of? What's this dot matrix picture showing in the picture? So just let me know that. Hopefully it doesn't just look like randomness. Okay, there you go, Kobe. That's good. That's kind of what I was hoping someone would say, and that is what I tried to draw. It's just an ocean scene. You know, these are waves, basically. I've heard people say, oh, is it mountains? Yeah, I could have guessed that someone might have thought that, but no, there's such sharp tips, right? And there's so many in a sequence. Anyway, it's waves. Here's the sun beaming down. You see the rays of sunlight. And these are a couple of, I guess, birds, whatever, flying over the ocean. Now, we can assume, as given in the example, that this is a fully fleshed out dot matrix picture, all the little dots combined to form the thing. I know I've already given you two different ways of thinking of such an example, the dot matrix picture of a printed image or the digitized image on a pixelated device where you have a screen. You can also, just to add one more or two more, you can also think of artwork that's done in the style of mosaic. Have you ever seen these kind of mosaic works where there's a bunch of little tiles, some kind of Renaissance art, you know, like a big picture of Jesus or Mother Mary, and it's made out of a bunch of little colored tiles put into a certain order and arrangement. So when you look at the big thing, you just see the image, but when you zoom in, you'd see tiles, tiles, tiles put together. There's also pointillist art. There's another technique of art that does the same kind of thing. And I've even seen some of these weird, have you seen these pictures that are like, it's a big picture, but it's each little block within it is a picture of its own. So it's like you see a person's face, but when you zoom in, it's like a bunch of tiny little photos. Anyway, such examples serve the same purposes as this, but we're going with this. So here's a dot matrix picture, okay? Let's introduce some terminology next that the author brings in. He says the term global feature is now to be mentioned, and a global feature is just like any kind of large scale or big picture aspect of a composite like this. Okay, so let me put that down and then we'll talk about it more. Global features. Global feature. A quote unquote big picture aspect of the composite. And so like this is a composite, it's something composed out of a bunch of little elements, and it forms a big picture. Now, a global feature of the dot matrix in this case is like one of the things that is formed out of all the little dots. So what's a global feature? It's not a dot by itself individually, but it is something that is formed by a bunch of the dots combining together, okay? So if I ask you now, what's, for example, one of the global features of this image here? That's why you're given it as an example so we can refer to it. You should not say the whole thing. You should point out like some object or event inside of the inside of the dot matrix that's created by the dots. So here's a question. What is one of the dot matrix global features? Very good name, in the waves. Correct. The waves are a thing depicted in the image that are the product of all these dots combined. Let's make sure, oh good, Kobe, yes, stained glass windows would be another fair example. You say waves, Naaman? Good. And good, Kobe, the birds. That could be another one. The birds flying up, or whatever they are, those are also shown in image, and they're another global feature of the image. Or you could have said the sun, right? Okay, so we're all clear. A global feature is just one like element of the thing that you can pick out, which is a creation of a bunch of dots combined. Okay, now, let's make this next point. I want you to consider what it would be like if we had a second dot matrix that we could compare with this one. Okay, so let me list this as dot matrix A. And suppose that we had another dot matrix B, and I'm writing the question mark because I'm asking you a question. Suppose that with respect to dot matrix B, it is a dot for dot replica of A. Okay, so like assume that when it comes to B, the placement of each dot with regard to B is exactly mapped over from A. So they're point for point, dot for dot duplicated, okay? So if this B dot matrix, that I'm not going to draw, but I'm just describing it for you, if B is a dot for dot duplicate of A, then how would it appear by comparison to A? Maybe, hopefully this question doesn't lose you or stump you. but think it through and just give me your best answer. If I created a dot matrix B, which perfectly replicates the order and the distribution of dots from A, then how would B appear by comparison to A? Like, what would it look like? The second one. Correct, Kobe. It would be the same picture, yes. It's just a carbon copy then. It's like the equivalent of stamping the same image on a new grid. So it would be the same picture, and can we follow up a bit more? Would it have all the same global features, utilizing this terminology? Would it have all the same global features if it was a dot-for-dot duplicate, down to every last dot? Would it have all the same global features? That's a yes or no. Yes, it would. Correct. It would have the same global features. And why? Well, because it's just sort of like logically necessary. If these global features are just the result of the array of dots that form the image, then if we have an exactly identical array, it's going to have the same global features because these global features are nothing other than their composition out of these dots. So same composition, same global features, same dot distribution, same global features. Okay, now another little question. Suppose that with dot matrix B, I draw dot matrix B, or I create dot matrix B, and it's almost identical to A, but there's one difference of global feature. In this case with B, let's suppose there's only one bird shown, or an extra bird, 3. Whatever the case is, it would be a different global feature. So tell me this, if B has even one global feature that's different from A, having those different global features also implies that they have to be different in what other fundamental way? So same dots, same global features, but different global features in two matrices would also imply what other kind of difference? If they have different global features, then they must, of course, differ in what way? Let me know. So you were quick to say that if they had the same distribution of dots, they would have the same global features. And correct, Kobe, if they have the different global features, if the large scale features are different, then they cannot be the same at the particle level of each dot, right? Because if there was, say, an extra bird, then of course the dots would not be distributed equally in both cases, because there would be dots here that there would not be in this case to depict the additional bird. Or if there was like a missing bird, for example, only 1 here and 2 in this case, then even if every other dot was mapped over exactly identically, there would be an absence of dots in B which depict the second bird from A. So again, hopefully this takeaway is not so complex. All we are saying, once you understand the concept of a dot matrix and you understand that the global features are made out of those dots, it's easy to understand that if you have two matrices which are identical at the level of dots, they will have the same global features. And if they are different at the global level, at the big picture level, the macroscopic level, then they will have to differ at that microscopic level, okay? So all of this discussion of dot matrices and comparing two with each other is leading up to the real analogy that's next going to come in. So the author Stoljar says that when you consider physicalism, a thesis about the universe, which says everything's made out of matter, we can import our understanding of these dot matrices to that concept. Okay, so now I want you to think of our whole physical universe. Look around you, all this stuff, me, you, and everything else, the planet Earth and all the sun and stars and all the other cosmos. This physical universe, you could sort of think of it on parallel to a dot matrix, okay? But because our universe, one can argue, especially according to physicalism, is itself a large-scale structure with a bunch of objects and events in it, but they're also made out of fundamentally little tiny particles. Now, with the dot matrix, the little bits were dots of ink. With the digital screen, the dots or whatever were pixels. Or with the mosaic, they could be little tiles or stained glass. Now, in physical reality, what can you tell me about that? If we were going to sort of claim that physical reality and the universe is similar to a dot matrix, then what would be the things serving the role of the dots? Of course, our reality is not made out of ink dots nor pixels, but what would be the sort of stand-in for those things? Good, once again, Kobe, atoms, yes. So atoms are, you know, the generic phrase for the tiniest pieces of matter that we could possibly think of. So according to physicalism, this universe is kind of like a dot matrix because everything in it is just made out of little atoms. And global features of the universe, like global features of the dot matrix, are also nothing other than a combination of little atoms put together in a particular order. So, utilizing our terminology of global feature, somebody here tell me, what is one global feature of the universe? Okay, you told me here a global feature was like the waves or the bird or the sun. So now I'm asking a similar question, but just as applied to the physical reality. What could be a global feature of this reality? So now you got to pick out like an object or an event in reality that's made out of atoms. So don't tell me an atom, but something that is a bunch of atoms bundled together in a given way. Okay, so stars, whiteboards, very good. The Milky Way galaxy, all of those things are correct. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but whatever those things are, they're objects and they're events that exist in the universe. And according to physicalism, these are just a bunch of atoms bundled together, and that combination, we see it or experience it as the given object or event. Okay, so how about this? Let me ask you a yes or no. If physicalism is true and this discussion of everything being made out of atoms is really real, according to the terminology here, would you be a global feature of the universe? Are you a global feature of the universe based on this analysis anyway? What do you think? Yes, you are, because you're an object in this universe. And even though you're a small object in comparison to the gigantic universe, you're something, and you're not just a particle. You're the result of a whole bunch of particles combined, and they form this biological member of the species Homo sapiens that you happen to be. So on physicalism, just as with these dot matrix analogies, everything in reality, from the biggest to the smallest things, are just made out of the tiny little atoms that compose everything. Now, remember before we said this, that if you had two dot matrices, where the second one was the identical distribution of dots as the first, that the second would have all the same global features as the first. So now I want you to really think outside the box for a minute, but by now, deep into the semester of philosophy, I'm hoping that's kind of becoming a little more easier. So here's my question. Suppose, just for sake of discussion here, that there was a second universe. Okay, now I know, what, is that already mind-blowing? It's only one universe, perhaps. But let's suppose, just to think about it, like suppose there was a second universe somehow. And imagine that this second universe, call it universe B, was an atomic copy of ours. So like every atom in universe B has the exact same position and relation to the other atoms as we see here in universe A. Okay, so this is like an atomic physical copy of ours, this second universe that I'm hypothetically discussing with you now. So according to the concept of supervenience, how would that second universe be by relation or comparison to ours? If it was an atomic copy of ours, then by analogy and on similar reasons, what would we think of the second universe? How would it appear to be? Question again. If the universe B was an atomic physical copy of ours, so atom for atom, a copy. If it was atomically identical, then what would it be like in general when you compare it to our universe? There you go. So if it's an atomic copy, then it would be exactly the same. It would be identical, meaning that all the same events and objects would exist in there as do here. There would be counterparts of all events and objects there. So now the word supervenience, how is it used as a verb? It's used as a verb when you say that you have a large structure, that's a composite structure, and in such a case, all the large-scale global features of that thing supervene on the distribution and order of the little parts. So it's basically like a part-whole relation. With supervenience, we say that if the parts are identically arranged in two cases, then all of the large-scale holistic features will also be identical too, as they call them here, global features. Meaning, as applied to the physical reality, that if there were a duplicate physical universe, there would be a copy of every event happening here. So let's follow up on that. If there were, again, speaking hypothetically, this physical copy of our universe, which was atomically identical to ours, would Joe Biden be the president right now in that universe? Let me know. Because he's the president in our universe, for sure. But would he be a president in the universe B if it was an atomic copy of ours? Yes, he would, Kobe. Good. So I'm glad that you're able to follow me. Why would he be? Because the fact that he is the president in our universe is just the outcome of all these atoms playing out according to the laws of physics and nature. So whatever has happened here would have to be completely replicated there. Would JFK still have been assassinated in this other universe? Yes, because the events that caused this were just the playing out of physical forces according to laws of nature applied to the atoms that composed all the events. So there could not be even any difference. And let's get into this. Would there be a duplicate of you in this hypothetical second universe, which was an atomic physical copy of ours? Would there be a duplicate of you taking a duplicate of this class, taking a duplicate of this lecture? And again, the answer is yes. But that's where we really see what physicalism is claiming by means of supervenience. That, okay, Kobe, you use supervenience as a verb by saying that large-scale structures supervene on the order of the parts that compose them. Okay, so like in a dot matrix, the birds supervene on the distribution of ink dots. The ocean, the large global feature of the ocean, supervenes on the underlying array of ink dots. And so in physical terms, you're an object, and you, the global feature that you are, supervenes on the underlying distribution of atoms that make things up. So you're basically nothing other than a composite of atoms, just as this bird is nothing other than a composite of ink dots. So supervenience holds from the macro to the micro. The large-scale macro structure supervenes on the distribution and order of the parts, whatever the parts may be. In this case, the parts are ink dots, but in physical space, the parts would be atoms. Okay. And so, as I was just saying, though, a very good question. Your consciousness, your mental life, like have a thought right now about whatever, you know, imagine something, dream something, think of your mom's face or like what you did on New Year's or your last birthday. When you're having that thought in your head, you may think that this thought that I'm having is not necessarily governed by the atomic physical structure of my body or the reality. But what physicalism says is that no, it is. And so if there were a physical copy of this universe, another closed physical system with the same exact distribution of atoms, then not only would there be a copy of you, but that copy would have all the same thoughts, feelings, pleasures, pains, and everything else mental inside of the head. So what that means is that consciousness is not independent of the physical. If the physical factors are held fixed and same, then all the psychological factors will be identical as well. Dualists don't agree with that. Dualists say that the mind or the soul, whatever it is independent and free of the body. And so according to dualism, it should be possible that if there were two identical physical specimens with the same brain configuration, that they could still have different thoughts. Because according to dualism, your consciousness is not necessarily rooted in the physical brain, but is something entirely separate from the whole body. But what supervenience and physicalism is telling you is no, that if you have consciousness and thoughts, that's just a global feature exhibited in the physical universe by atoms. And if there were, per hypothesis, a second physical copy of the universe, then it would be identical down to the last detail, even when it comes to consciousness and elements and aspects of human thought. So consciousness is just caught up in the matrix of physical forces too, so much so that if we could imagine a physical duplicate of our situation, it would have identical psychological phenomena. And so this gives rise to the full formal statement of physicalism that he now provides, which is on page 580. So I can only say this after having gone through that somewhat long-winded description of supervenience. And here's what the definition really is. So he says, physicalism is true at a possible world W just in case, the following, just in case any world which is an atomic duplicate of W like a physical copy of W is a duplicate of W in all respects. Okay, so if physicalism, I know it looks a little technical because of the talk of possible worlds and etc., but let me go through it and I'll try and make it simple. It's saying this: if physicalism is true in our universe, so possible world W is just like our whole universe. If physicalism is true in our universe, that means this: that if there were any other universe, which was, sorry, I meant to write the word duplicate, so please forgive my momentary error in the way of writing the definition. Just it should have said atomic duplicate. So you just have to add the word duplicate in between what had been written as atomic and of. Okay, so let me return to this and say it again. It says that if the physicalism is true in our universe, that is the case if any other universe which was an atomic copy of ours would be a copy of our universe in all respects, implying that if there was a physical copy of our universe, then it would not just be a physical copy, it would be a psychological copy, a historical copy. In all possible ways, it would be a copy. So if physicalism is true, then we could not imagine a second world which is an atomic copy of ours, but there's different thoughts. Okay, so what you have to imagine, according to physicalism, is that if you have two closed physical systems with the same order and pattern and distribution of atoms in it, then just like two-dot matrices with the same exact underlying parts, they would have to have all the same global features, which also encompasses consciousness. So it is a denial of the view that consciousness could be different if the physical factors were identical. Okay, and so let me read a little from the book, and you'll hear him say it. Quoting David Lewis, who first introduced the dot matrix analogy, we see on page 580, a dot matrix picture has global properties, and yet all there is to the picture is dots and non-dots at each point of the matrix. The global properties are nothing but patterns of dots. They supervene. No two pictures can differ in their global properties without differing somewhere in whether there is or is not a dot. Lewis's example gives us one way to introduce the basic idea of physicalism. The basic idea is that the physical features of the universe are like the dots in the picture. So when he says physical features, he refers to like the small-scale atomic structure of the universe. The basic idea is that the atomic features of the world are like the dots in the picture, and the psychological or biological or social features of the world are like the global properties of the picture. Just as the global features of the picture are nothing but a pattern in the dots, so too the psychological, biological, and social features of the world are nothing but a pattern in the physical atoms of the universe. To use the language of supervenience, just as the global features of the picture supervene on the dots, so too everything supervenes on atoms if physicalism is true. And then he says here, if physicalism is true at our world, then no other world can be physically identical to it without being identical to it in every way. And this suggests the following definition. Physicalism is true at a possible world W if and only if, just in case, any world which is a physical copy of W is a duplicate of W simpliciter, which is a Latin term which means in all ways or in general. Okay, so that's our answer then to the interpretation question. What it means to say that everything is physical is to say that everything supervenes on atoms, even consciousness does. So that's what it does mean to say that everything is physical. Therefore, we've answered our interpretation question. Again, the meaning of the claim that everything is physical is that every single thing is the product of atoms bundled together in various combinations. And that if there were a second physical system with the same distribution of atoms, then it would be identical in all ways, including with respect to consciousness. So this implies that consciousness is nothing other than a physical phenomenon because it's ultimately reducible to the order and composition of atoms that form those things. No different than, even if it's more complex and interesting, no different essentially than this marker, which is an object formed out of a bunch of atoms that bundle together marker-wise. You and I are very complex and interesting physical objects which have a point of view and a subjective experience as a mental being. But we're also just atoms bundled together in a certain way. And again, per hypothesis, if there was a second physical system with atoms arranged identically, then there would be exactly equivalent physical phenomena and mental phenomena too. Okay, so that leads us into the last part of his essay. And I told you that he had two big questions. So it would take some time to show his answer to the first one that requires the discussion of supervenience. But there was the other question too, which was the question of the truth question. Is it true, though, that everything is physical? Well, Stoljar does believe that it is true. And he gives two arguments to try and defend that is the case. So I'm going to try and point out these two arguments, and we'll discuss them. So now we're moving on to that truth question. And again, his way of trying to provide the answer, yes, it's true, is to hit us with these two arguments. Okay, so here's the first one. Again, with the goal of establishing that physicalism is true. He calls the argument from causal closure. Causal closure. Okay, now I just want to make sure right off the bat that we don't have any kind of spelling error with this, just because I've taught this class enough to have seen student work coming back where there's a common misspelling that the people write casual, but this is not the word casual, there's a different spelling. Casual is C-A-S-U-A-L. This is causal, which is C-A-U-S-A-L. And causal has to do with cause and effect. Casual has not. Casual is a totally different word, even though the spelling's similar. Casual is like, you know, you're wearing sweats or whatever to the office on casual day. But causal, separate word. And we're talking about causal here, as in cause and effect. Okay, so anyway, the argument from causal closure. As many arguments in philosophy and logic are given, we find three premises which lead to the conclusion. Premises are reasons to support a conclusion, and the conclusion is the claim that you're trying to prove. So let me walk you through the premises and conclusion of this argument. So the first premise just says that every event which has a cause has a physical cause. Okay, so every event which even has a cause has a physical one. Okay, that's the first premise. All that is saying is that, you know, since we live in a universe which is a physical universe, if anything happens, there had to be a physical reason for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Okay, as one just random example. Oh, by the way, let me just say this. My car got broken into this weekend. I didn't even say that. I was going to mention it at the beginning, but it was kind of stressful at the moment because it was parked in its designated spot, and someone smashed in the back driver's window and took out a nice guitar. I mean, it had a $1,500 guitar in there. It's probably why they broke into it. But anyway, it's getting all replaced. Insurance and stuff. I already filed claims, and they're sending me a check for the guitar, and I have to pay a little deductible for the window, but insurance is mostly covering that because it covers some vandalism. Anyway, I just mentioned that because I have a standard example where I talk about damage happening to somebody's car, and then as soon as I mentioned it, in my mind and in my consciousness, I started having mental images of the photos that I took of the smashed window. But anyway, not a big deal, just a digression. I could have used that as my example. I could say, okay, well, suppose a car got broken into, but then it involves a human being that breaks into it, and I'd rather just leave the consciousness aside because that's what we're trying to prove in the argument. So, yeah, these things happen, you know, whatever. Maybe someone's going to enjoy that guitar. It was a nice one. It was an American Fender Telecaster, $1,450 retail before tax, but they gave me almost the full value for it, $1,320. So it's a negotiated settlement with my home insurance, so it's fine. But anyways, let's go with a different example. Suppose that your car's parked somewhere, and a heavy tree branch falls on top of the hood and causes some damage to your hood. So that's an event, the damage of the car. And if you're asking what caused it, well, what could have caused it except for something physical, right? So, okay, the branch has gradually weakened over time by the effect of weather and wind and maybe temperature drying out. And then on that occasion, a particular force, perhaps a gust of wind, caused it to finally detach from the branch. Then its mass, its angle of descent, forces of gravity caused it to impact the hood of the car, resulting in the damage. So every step of the process along the way, there's a physical cause of the next effect. And so this is just saying that that's generally true across the board. I mean, you exist. What's the physical cause? Well, of course, the physical conception of the egg by the sperm with your parents' act of conception in the past. Or, why does this can exist? Because it was an assembly line process at a factory, and then there was a shipping process that delivered it to the market where I bought it. Okay, so there's physical causes all the way down. Now, the second premise continues by saying something interesting. It says that mental events can cause physical events. Mental events can cause physical events. Okay. So all this one is saying is something that is actually obviously true, but it's often overlooked. It's kind of interesting, but it just means that your mind, by thinking, can cause, your actions that we see when your body does things behaviorally. So here's an example. Watch, I'm going to snap my fingers. Well, the left hand finger. And that happened. That's an event. The finger snapping is like a physical thing that happened. But why did it happen? What was the cause? What caused my fingers to snap right there? I mean, well, you could say because the muscles contracted in the fingers and hand. And I could ask, well, why did that happen? And then we would say, okay, well, because nerve signals were sent from the brain to the muscle groups in the hand, directing it to do that. But then we can ask, why were those signals sent to the hand? And I mean, the reason is because I'm a professor and I'm trying to demonstrate a concept in philosophy to my students. So I think in my mind, let me show them something. Let me do a clap and then show how thinking of it leads to it happening. So it's my choice that led to that. Even me speaking to you right now, like that's happening. There's a voice, there's sound coming out of this body. Well, why is that happening? Well, we could talk about all the physical forces, the wind, the esophagus, the voice, the vocal box. But ultimately, it's happening because I'm deciding to give a lecture to you, and therefore my choice leads to this result, my will. Okay, so when you think of something, like even Kobe, right? You typed a comment just now, and now the comment's there in the live chat. So it exists, and it's something that happened. But if we ask why it happens, well, your fingers tapped it in, and then why did that happen? Because you had a choice and a desire to contribute to the discussion, which was good. So decisions, thoughts, your will can, of course, and does, of course, lead to whatever it is that you do. Setting aside the case of like involuntary actions that are not done on the basis of a decision, like if you're snoring while you're asleep, or if you have a reflex movement because something hits like your knee, that's not necessarily, a mental event causing it. Well, I don't know if I want to say that. It's not an intentional event, but it obviously still is something that's cognitive that led to it happening, or physiological. Okay, so premise 2 is just saying that thought can produce action. I sometimes like to use the case of the JFK assassination because it's something that we all know happened and it's an interesting, kind of historical touchstone. We can ask, why did he die? And well, he died because his brain was hit by a bullet at a high velocity. But why did that happen? Because the bullet was ejected from the firing mechanism of a firearm. And why did that happen? Well, because pressure was applied to the trigger mechanism. And it was pointed in a certain direction. But why did that happen? Oh, because the muscle groups in the finger, squeeze the trigger. And that happened because the brain sent the signals to it. But why did the brain send the signals to the hand to do that? Because the person had an intention and a nefarious, obviously bad desire to kill the president, which he did. So, again, whether it's something every day, like typing in a comment in a chat, or you're performing in a sport or playing a musical instrument, or just any action that you could possibly think of under the sun, it's something that can be described as a mental event producing a physical outcome. Okay. Now, the third premise is the one that at least looks a little bit more complicated than it needs to. But at the end of the day, it's actually saying something that I think is pretty straightforward. Nonetheless, bear with me as I write it and forgive the somewhat complex wording that is used. Here's what it says. It says that if an event A causes an event B, then, in that case, there's no other event that also causes B. That's basically what it's going to say, but let me write it out the right way. Then there is no other event, C, which is different from A and which also causes B. Okay, so let me read it here for you. It says, if an event A causes an event B, then that means that there is no other event C, which is different from A and which also causes B. So all that it's saying is that if A causes B, that's it. It's the only cause. There's not anything other than A, which is like a second cause of B. It's just A. maybe to reword this in a little bit of a simpler statement, let's see if you can complete my thought here. What this is saying, in a more easy way of putting it, is that for every effect, there's exactly how many causes? Can you tell me that based on what it says in 3? For every effect, there is only no more, no less than this number of causes. How many causes for each effect? Based on the argument, anyway. So that's a number. Correct, yes, Janice, correct, Kobe. It's one cause. So there's only one cause for each effect, not more than one. That's all this is saying. This is sometimes called the exclusion principle because it says that we exclude all other causes aside from a single cause for a given effect. Okay, so I don't know how many different ways I can put it, but that's basically it. If A causes B, A is the only cause of B. There's nothing other than A that is also the cause of B. It is only just A. Okay, so one cause for each effect. Of course, there cannot be 0 causes. That would not make sense. But there's also not 2, 3, or 4, or any other numbers, just one. So then, what these 3 premises seem to imply is the conclusion, which I could write below, but it's kind of so compressed. So I'll just type it into the chat. Here's the conclusion of the argument. It just is the statement that mental events are physical events. So what it should appear to be in your notes, if you draw notes, is a line here, horizontal line, and then that conclusion that I typed, sorry, at the bottom. I mean, I can write it, but it's kind of small. Mental events are physical events. Let me explain how this conclusion supports the truth of physicalism and how it follows from the 3 premises above. Okay, so the conclusion says mental events just are physical events, which would mean that when you think of something and that produces an action that we can all see, or that you at least could see, even the thought that you're having is just a physical event. So if your thoughts and choices are, yes, this is the conclusion of the causal closure argument. That's right, Kobe. Thank you. But as I was saying, if mental events are just themselves physical happenings, like if your choices and thoughts and your willing of doing something is just the brain activity, then that means that everything's physical. Because the only one thing that anybody thinks is not physical, even dualists, is consciousness. So if we could say that consciousness is just a physical process itself, then there's no room left for anything that's not physical in the universe, because the one and only thing people suppose is not physical is somehow like your life of your mind and your thoughts and your inner mental life. Like that has to do with your soul or your spirit or something that's not physical. But on this argument, that is physical, because even those mental events of choosing, willing, deciding, that's physical too. But let me show you how this gets there. Okay, now according to the first premise, every event that has a cause at least has a physical cause. And from premise 2, the mind can cause things to happen. But look at these physical events that our mind can cause. If I clap my hands, that's a physical event caused by my mind choosing to do it. But premise 1 says that every event that has a cause has a physical cause, which means that when I do things behaviorally, they have a physical cause, which is the brain signals coming down, okay? That's where premise 3 kicks in, because premise 3 says that we already know the brain is one cause of your observable behavior. And this just denies that there could be anything separate from it that's also the cause. So what premise 3 is trying to say is, like, it's not that it's the brain and the soul, because that would be one cause too many. We know for a fact that the brain is involved in producing all of your behavior, your motor behavior, and your cognitive behavior that we see through your actions. So since the brain is already known to be a physical cause of your behavior, premise 3 denies that there could be anything else, because that would add a second cause, which is more than is necessary. So why say that it is both your brain causing your actions, but also your soul? The brain is already a self and soul-sufficient explanation for the production of all of your acts. So to add to that, that there's some mysterious non-physical soul that's sort of jointly causing you to do things in tandem with the brain would be to add more causes than are necessary. So if there's only one cause for each effect, then when your mind causes your body to do things, that's physical too. And to say that there's that physical cause, but there's also something non-physical involved, would be to multiply causes beyond necessity and to violate the principle that for each event there's one single cause. Now, there's room for criticism, as with all arguments. You may reject premise 3. You may say, I don't know. Is it really true that each event has a single cause? I give you the case of your parents, and you may say, well, look, I exist, but I have two causes, my mom and my dad. But I think that in response to such a criticism, Stoljar would insist that although there's two people involved in the production of you, there's a single event, which is the event of fertilization. And so we can always describe a single event as having a single cause, as long as we describe it in the proper way. I mean, like I had a student that I was teaching this to yesterday that said, what about like, really complex things like World War I, can you really say there was one cause of that? And I was kind of thinking about his question, which was a good question. But in a way, though, it's poorly defined what the event is. World War I is kind of a vague description of things. But if you want to be more specific, you could say that, well, the assassination of Franz Joseph was the cause of this policy decision by another country. And that event was the cause of another specific effect. And if you kind of link each individual local event to a local cause, then you can still preserve the truth of this principle, which does have, I think, some intuitive force. Another counterexample is like I've heard the firing squad counterexample. Say one person is shot by like 6 shooters in a firing squad for execution. And you might say, well, there's not a single cause of death. There's 6 shooters. But you could re-describe the whole firing squad as the single cause that overdetermines the person's death. And in that way, we get back to saying there was one cause. So anyway, guys, despite the criticisms, don't want to overcomplicate it too much. It's a pretty straightforward argument. And one last just review. Everything has a physical cause in order for it to happen in the first place. And when your mind causes things to happen, well, that's got the physical cause of the brain. And premise 3 then simply says that since the brain is known to be a physical cause of your behavior, there could not be something other than the brain which is also responsible for those actions or outcomes. So that's about it. And Kobe, this question mark that you put, maybe it appeared in the chat later or I didn't notice it at first, but I thought I answered your question, which is you asked if this was the conclusion of the causal closure argument, and it is. Yes, the conclusion statement that I typed in the chat is this sentence here, and it's the conclusion of that argument. Okay, there was one other argument that the author does give to try and also defend physicalism as true. In my opinion, this is the better of the two arguments. It's the more interesting of the two arguments. The other one is easy to understand and pretty simple, though, by comparison. So let me just tell you quickly about the other one, and that's where we'll end today. Stoljar says, if you want a second look at trying to defend and justify physicalism, you can also utilize the argument from methodological naturalism. Okay, so this argument just has 2 premises which lead to our ultimate conclusion. And the first premise says that it is reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. Okay, first premise, it's reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. So all it is saying is that if you believe what the scientific community says in their consensus views, then you'll be reasonable too, because what scientists believe is inherently reasonable. And I think that's an easy claim to support, because even though sometimes people disagree with scientific claims, it's like someone might have religious reasons or whatever for saying, no, I don't believe in evolution, or I don't believe that the age of the planet Earth is billions of years. I don't know, right? So some people have those views. But even if you think that, and you're like not so supportive of certain scientific theories or claims, you really can't say, though, that the scientists are just wacky and they're just coming up with stuff that has no evidence. I mean, at a minimum, you have to concede that they're being reasonable, because everything scientific has to be justified based on empirical data that you could actually experimentally verify. So scientists don't just say, hey, I've got a wild idea, maybe this is true, who knows? No, they have to offer you like detailed and experimentally verified conclusions that could be replicated by other scientists too. So if you didn't have evidence to support your scientific theory, that's not science. Science doesn't just say, I've got wild guesses to throw out there. It's based on research that's involving, test and experiment. So at a minimum, even if you disagreed with some of those things, I mean, after all, sometimes reasonable claims can be false. You can have a justified false belief. But it's not so easy to say that at a minimum, scientists are being reasonable. So it's simply saying that because scientists are reasonable, if you believe what they believe, you're going to kind of piggyback on their reasonableness. And then premise 2 is simple. It just says, physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. Okay, so if it's reasonable basically to believe whatever the scientific community does, and by the way, they believe physicalism, at least methodologically, then that means, therefore, that it is reasonable for you to believe it. It is reasonable to believe in physicalism. That's the conclusion. So based on this argument, why does this conclusion follow? Well, it's following because the argument claims that whatever the scientific community believes would be reasonable for you to believe as well. And they happen to believe physicalism, so that would be a reasonable thing for you to believe. Now, I said that I thought this was like a little less satisfying intellectually than the other argument. And the only reason I say that is because with the other argument, it directly tells you, the reader or student, whoever you are, why you should think that physicalism is true. But in this case, it doesn't really give you the reason. It kind of outsources the intellectual labor to the community of rational scientists, which, to be fair, we do have to do that a lot in life. I mean, we can't all be hyper-specialized, so we have to defer to like chemists, physicists, theoretical physicists, and so on, because many of us, as you know, have not chosen to dedicate our lives to knowing all about those things. So it's like deferring to your doctor, right? You don't know everything about medicine, so they give you a diagnosis and a clinical course of treatment, and you just follow their opinion because they're the specialist, not you. So it is kind of reasonable to defer to the expertise of scientists, but at the same time, as a philosopher, it's a little more satisfying when you are told why they think those things. So this argument is kind of like, hey, over there, smart scientists are coming up with ideas, and who knows why, but they must be reasonable, so just follow their lead. The other argument, at least, gives you a satisfying explanation as to why this is believed to be true, because there could not be more than one cause for each effect, and the brain is known to be a cause of your behavior, so shouldn't that be the only available explanation of it? See, at that way of looking at the argument, I can consider the reasons, but in this case, we just defer all the intellectual labor to a different community of experts. So I don't know. They're both arguments. They're both trying to make the same conclusion, that physicalism is reasonable or that it's true. But you've got your own views anyway. Maybe you prefer one over the other. That's just my own thoughts as we close the meeting today. So we're good to go with Daniel Stoljar. On Thursday this week, next class, we'll talk about J.J.C. Smart, and maybe we'll also be able to get into Alan Turing. So I would say read those two essays if you can before Thursday, and we'll at least cover the J.J.C. Smart, and maybe we'll be able to start with Turing. If not, we'll get into him on Tuesday when we start next week. Okay, then thanks again, everyone. Don't want to keep you any longer. Let me know that everything's good, and then I can close the stream out. As usual, be in touch with me if you need anything by email or through office hours, and I'll be happy to, look at any drafts if people send me those later on or whenever they're done. But yeah, guys, thank you, Alessandra, and thanks everybody else. Appreciate you attending again. I'll see you back soon. For now, though, have a good one, and take care till Thursday. Okay, bye-bye.